Easter Sunday, the Resurrection Sunday, some churches have taken to calling it, it's not possible without Good Friday. The empty tomb is not possible unless there was something previously in the tomb, and that is not possible without the cross. We often think of the cross as just, well, the little statuette-type crosses that we have up here on the piano and the organ, or the two kind of decorative crosses here on either side of me, lit by these lamps. The big light-up cross here, which is a very nice thing. It was donated to the church in memory of a person who passed away in an accident. We often think of the cross as these things. I don't normally say what I'm about to say, but I think sometimes the Catholic Church has one thing right. They often portray Christ on the cross. Now, it is important that Christ did not stay on the cross, and we're going to get there. But it is also important that we remember Christ on the cross. And it is important that we remember that the cross was not nicely varnished and stained, that it wasn't adorned with royal purple, that it wasn't decorative with fleur-de-lis and all of this. It doesn't light up with light bulbs. The cross was rough-hewn timber. Think of a telephone pole, and you're getting closer. Logs. They probably wouldn't have even had the bark taken off of them. Just hammered into place with a notch, or possibly even tied together. What Jesus carried through the streets is not what you see over here, the whole cross. He just carried the crossbar. And even that was too much for him after what the Roman soldiers had done to his body in his scourging. Cross is not a nice thing. It's not a pretty thing. The real cross you would not want hanging on the wall in your kitchen. It was a rough and nasty thing, and the people of the time understood what it was. The most brutal form of execution created up to that time. It was the electric chair, the firing squad, the gas chamber, all rolled into one. You went up onto the cross and you didn't come back down until you were all the way dead. And sometimes that took hours, because the primary cause of death in crucifixion was asphyxiation. You're hanging from your arms, and gravity is pulling your body down. Every time you need to take a breath, you have to lift with your shoulders to lift your body up in order to fill your lungs, and then slump back down as you exhale. Every breath is harder and harder and harder. I'm asthmatic. It's like having an asthma attack for hours. One continuous asthma attack for hours and hours and hours. Every breath, you get just a little bit less air until either your muscles give out or you're just not able to get enough air to bring oxygen to your brain. Either way, you were going to die, and the guard that stood at the foot of your cross was going to make sure of that. Sometimes they would break their legs, the people that were on the cross, so that they would die sooner, because they would push up with their legs as they were pushing up with their arms. Break the legs, it happens quicker. I want you to join me in Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27, and starting in verse 33. Matthew chapter 27 is one of the longer chapters in the Bible, 66 verses in total. And all of it is about the torture and execution of Christ. Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 33. Matthew writes, "And when they came to a place called Golgotha," which means the place of a skull, They gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. Now, Matthew uses the word Golgotha. He was writing to a Hebrew audience, mainly Jewish people. They would have recognized this name. It's a hill outside of Jerusalem where executions traditionally would have taken place. Even before the Romans came along, the Jewish people and then the Greek people who occupied them used Golgotha as a place for executions. It was outside the city, but it was close enough to the city that everybody knew what it was. It translates to the place of a skull. In Greek, when they were writing and then translating in Greek, they kept the name Golgotha. They just transliterated it. They just wrote that name in Greek letters because it was possible for them to do that. When the Bible was later translated into Latin, a man named Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, what he called the Vulgate, or in the common language. He translated the word to Calvary, which you sometimes hear that name used to describe the same place. It's all the same place, whether you read Golgotha in Matthew or Calvary in Luke. It's all the same. In verse 34, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. And essentially what they were trying to do was get him a little bit drunk so that he wouldn't feel as much. Gall would have been like a fortified wine mixed with a little bit of vinegar. It would have been very strong. Think of it like putting a little bit of port or sherry or Madeira in with your regular table wine. It would have made it stronger. They were trying to give him some kind of anesthesia to make this thing go a little bit easier for him. He refuses it. Verse 35. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. So they nail his hands and feet to the cross. We know that from other gospel accounts. They would have done that while he was laying down on the ground, and then lifted the cross up and put the end of the cross into a hole in the ground that was shored up with rocks so that it would stand straight up. So that's what it means when Matthew says, when they had crucified him. Matthew didn't find it necessary to explain all of that because, again, the audience he was writing to initially would have known what it meant for someone to be crucified. They would have seen it on a fairly regular basis. Everyone who lived under Roman occupation knew what it meant to be crucified. They divided up his clothing among them by casting lots. That seems kind of silly to me because we know that Jesus was first a carpenter and then an itinerant preacher. And I can tell you, as someone who has been an itinerant preacher, none of my clothes are worth gambling over. Right? It would have been common clothing. I don't imagine any of it would have been, royally dyed or fancy. None of it would have had jewels embroidered into it like the priest's costume would have. Why are they gambling over his clothes? It was one last humiliation. They sat down, verse 36, and began to keep watch over him there. They wanted to see how long it would take for him to die. Verse 37, and above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." I, Jesus, H, I can't remember. It's in here somewhere. But this inscription that we have up here, IHS, that stands for Jesus, King of Jews. And I want to talk very, very quickly about this because it's important culturally right now. I imagine most of you are not on social media on a regular basis. I am. I have to keep up with what the kids at the school are seeing online so that I can keep up with the language that they speak, so that I know when they're being inappropriate. Right now there's a massive discourse, particularly on Twitter, about the phrase, Christ is King. Certain people who claim to be Christians, but are in fact using Christianity to further their political opinions, have been using this phrase, Christ is King, as a way of putting down Jewish people. They've turned it into something anti-Semitic. They say, Christ is King and you killed him. This has been something that anti-Semites have done since the beginning of anti-Semitism, essentially. They say, Christ is king and you murdered him. Now, is it wrong to proclaim to the world that Christ is king? No. We should want to proclaim to the world that Christ is king. But don't follow it up with, don't say Christ is king, you filthy Jew. That is taking the Lord's name in vain. That's something God takes very seriously. They are people made in God's image. If you see that sort of behavior, whether online or out in public, it is your duty as a Christ follower to shut that down. Yes, Christ is king. No, we don't use that as a weapon. That was the charge. That's the reason why he was being crucified. He claimed to be the king of the Jews. That's what Herod and Pilate finally come down on and say, okay, he's claiming to be taking political power away from Rome by proclaiming himself king of the Jews. Fine, you Jewish people, we will give you permission to crucify him. The reason the Jews wanted him crucified is because he claimed to be God. He was blaspheming according to them. His claim to being God was true, but to their mind, he was blaspheming, and that's why they wanted him dead. The Romans acquiesced. They said, yeah, okay, well, the charge will be sedition. He's a traitor. He wants to take over the Israel, what they called Palestine, from the Romans and be the king of the Jews. So that's his charge. I'm going to skip a little bit through 38 through 44. It's essentially everybody comes up to the foot of the cross and they mock Jesus. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, they mock him. They say, oh, I thought you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, something that Jesus had said before, not realizing that he meant his death, burial, and resurrection. Some of them said, he cannot save himself. He's the king of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross and we will believe in him. Let God rescue him. And then in verse 44, Matthew says something that's interesting to me. He says, the robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with these same words. Now, in other gospel accounts, we read that one of the thieves that's crucified alongside Christ confesses Christ as Messiah, and Jesus says, truly I tell you, you will be with me in paradise by the end of the day. Matthew doesn't include that, and we go, now wait a second, that's a contradiction. We can't have contradictions in the Bible. Here's an explanation. Maybe Matthew wasn't close enough to the cross to hear them talking. Maybe Matthew knew that other gospel writers had already written about that account, and he thought it was more important to talk about how they were mocking him. We don't know. I can tell you this. Just because Matthew talks about it, or doesn't talk about it, and some other gospel writer does, doesn't make Matthew less correct. You have 4 people with 4 different views on a situation. They're going to have slightly different stories, and as I've said before, that's a good thing. If all 4 of them said exactly the same thing, you would expect that they had gotten together in a room and gotten their story straight. It's the same thing with eyewitness testimony in court. If you have 4 eyewitnesses of, say, a car accident, and every single one says exactly the same things in exactly the same words, you can be pretty darn sure they're making it up. Because they got together and they got their story straight. Verse 45. Now from the 6th hour, that's noon, darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour, that's 3 p.m. Yes, we're going to have an eclipse soon. No, that doesn't mean Christ is returning. I just want to make that very clear. We talked about this a little bit last week. No one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son of Man. And if anyone tells you Christ is going to return on this day at this time, you can be sure it'll happen any other day and any other time. But not exactly then. Just because we're about to have an eclipse does not mean Christ is coming back. Just because there may have been an eclipse during the crucifixion doesn't mean there's a connection. 46, about the 9th hour, again, that's 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And that is Aramaic for, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, other translations say Eloi instead of Eli. Doesn't really matter all that much. Both are linguistically correct. One is more of a Syriac Aramaic, and one is more of a Hebrew Aramaic. It doesn't really matter all that much. It's still the same words. And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, "This man is calling for Elijah," because he's calling out Eli or Eloi. El, E-L in English, is the Hebrew word for God. The first time God is named in the Bible, Genesis 1:1, it is Elohim, God Most High. And it's plural, and you could argue whether that's the royal we, like when the queen or the king gives their Christmas message, they refer to themselves as we and us, right? Some could argue about that. I say it's because God is a plurality. He is a trinity, one being, three persons. But here, Christ is talking specifically to the Father. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he is quoting a psalm. But they think he's calling out for Elijah, the prophet. It was common in that day to believe that the mighty prophets of the Old Testament were going to come back and be part of the Messiah's reign and kick the Romans out of Israel. They thought he was calling out for Elijah. They thought, oh man, he's really taking this Messiah thing really far. Like, it's over, dude. You're on the cross. You're about to die. Now you're going to call out for Elijah to come and start your kingdom? Come on, we get it. It was a scam. It was a con. You're not really the Messiah. That's what they're thinking. Immediately one of them ran, verse 48, and taking a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. But the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. So again, somebody's feeling mercy on him, decides to try to, give him something for the pain. The rest are like, no. Let's see what really happens, right? He's calling out for Elijah. Let's see if Elijah comes down and helps him out. Verse 50. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and he yielded up his spirit. Jesus says earlier during one of his meetings with Pilate, no one takes my life away from me. I give it up. Nobody can take it from me. No one has that authority. Jesus doesn't die of asphyxiation here. It doesn't go that far. He gives up his spirit. He chooses when his physical death occurs. And behold, verse 51, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Real quick, the veil of the temple, that separated the holy place of the temple from the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, where the presence of God dwelt. The veil was torn. There was another veil that separated the court of the Gentiles from the holy place, where you could only go through if you were Jewish. The veil was torn. The separation was finally over. Anyone can come into the presence of God because of Christ's sacrifice. People were raised from the grave. This proto-resurrection is the theological term. It's a sign of what will happen at the return of Christ. The sea and the land will give up their dead. Those who were asleep in Christ will be glorified and in his presence. All will be raised, both believer and non-believer, in the last day of judgment, whether to eternal rest or to eternal torment. All will be raised. This proto-resurrection, this first sign of what the resurrection would be, happens. Verse 54, now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, truly this was the Son of God. So like I said, they would have had a Roman guard, in this case a centurion, standing at the foot of each cross. In this case, the centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. And it's really clear here. Some people try to say that this Roman, this non-believer, what he really said was, this man was a son of the gods. The grammar doesn't let that happen. The Greek is very clear. This man was the singular Son of God, singular. In the same way we talked about last week, that God used Alexander the Great, a wicked pagan man, to set up the perfect circumstances for Christ's birth and Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. In that same way, God used a pagan, wicked man, a Roman centurion, not a believer, to proclaim Christ's divinity at the foot of the cross. God can use anybody. Be open to that. There's a funny story attached to this, and I've got a little bit of time, so I'll tell it. I can't remember the name of the movie. This is a story that was told to me by my choir director when I was in college, Dr. Kaufman. And there was this movie. It was one of John Wayne's first movies, and it was one of the biblical epics. And John Wayne is playing the centurion. And this is when he was first acting. He wasn't very good at it yet. And he had the one line, just the one. Surely this man was the Son of God. And when he said it, the director said, all right, cut. Marion, because that was John Wayne's real name, Marion. He said, Marion, can we get a little bit more awe in that line? And so they set it up again. Set it up, John Wayne's looking up at the cross. Rolling. Oh, surely this man was the Son of God. Okay, maybe it was funnier to me. But it is true that everyone who wasn't mocking Christ, everyone who was open to the call of God, was able to say with awe, surely this man is the Son of God. I guess I'll refrain from telling jokes from now on. Verse 55, many women were there looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him. And among them was Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John. Verse 57, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. And this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave. I want to take that section, 57 through 61. I want you to notice some parallels. A man named Joseph, who is not a member of Jesus' bloodline, takes him in and gives him a home. What does that sound like? That sounds like the Nativity. A man named Joseph, who is not part of Jesus' physical bloodline, takes him in and gives him a home. In this case, that home is a tomb. Jesus is wrapped in linens. Swaddling clothes, anyone? He is laid to rest in stone. Most scholars agree that the manger was probably hewn out of a large rock. And now here Joseph has laid him in a tomb hewn out of a large rock. And he is watched over by a woman named Mary. these parallels, these aren't just the creation of a good novelist, right? Matthew wasn't a professional creative writer. He was a tax collector. He didn't come up with this. God ordained it to happen this way. Right. These parallels. As soon as I read it while I was studying for today's sermon, I cried. I don't cry very often. I sat there and I had chills and I cried. Every moment of Christ's life, from his holy conception by the Holy Spirit through to his ascension into heaven, and even now today standing at the right hand of the Father, preordained, perfectly orchestrated. The power of God. These parallels tell the story. Taken in by a man named Joseph, who is not his physical family member, given a home, wrapped in linens, laid to rest on a rock, watched over by a woman named Mary. Verses 62 through 66 tell the story of how the Pharisees went to Pilate and asked him to put a guard around the tomb because they were worried that the disciples were going to go and steal Christ's body, because he had been telling people throughout his ministry, he'll be killed, 3 days later he'll rise again. They want to make sure that the disciples don't come along and steal the body and then proclaim to everyone, hey, Jesus Christ arose. He was right. So they put a guard on the tomb. In fact, Pilate said to them, you have a guard. Go make it as secure as you know how. So this guard may have been Roman, maybe not, but he was under the authority of the temple. They gave up one of their temple guards during a time when there were protests and riots over the execution of Christ, both before and after. They gave up one of their temple guards to make sure that no one stole Jesus' body. And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. So they rolled the stone in front of the tomb. Now they set a seal on it. Most likely what they did was they melted some wax around the edge where the stone made contact with the tomb to show if it had been moved, you would see the seal would have been broken. It's like caution tape at a crime scene today, right? Chapter 28. We've been through the crucifixion, we've been through the burial. All of that is nice and grim, and it makes for really good scaring children potential. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't, right? But now we get to say something that we haven't gotten to say. It's the title of chapter 28 in my copy of the scriptures. It says, Jesus is risen. Verse 1 of chapter 28. Now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, that is Sunday, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, that is the Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. If you ever want to go down a deep rabbit hole online, look up some YouTube videos about the actual descriptions of biblical angels. It is fascinating, some of the things people will come up with to try to explain away the appearances of angels to people. Biblically accurate angels, the way they're described in the Bible, are terrifying. And men, strong men, the temple guards, fall like dead men in the presence of the host of heaven. Verse 5, and the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he was laying. And go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him. Behold, I have told you. And they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to report it to his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them, the women, and greeted them, and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me." Now, the other Gospels tell us that the disciples, from the time of the crucifixion through until Sunday morning, were hiding in that same upper room where they had the Last Supper. I don't blame them for hiding. It was a scary time. They were worried that they were going to get arrested and executed too, probably. Jesus sends these women. He says, "Go, grab them, tell them to meet me in Galilee." Jesus isn't going into Jerusalem. They already rejected him. He's going back home to Galilee. And he wants his disciples to follow him back home to Galilee. Most of them were also Galileans. Verse 11, "Now while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble.' And they took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day." They were more willing to accept the punishment of admitting that they had fallen asleep on the job, which was an executable crime for a soldier. They were more willing to admit that and hope that the Jewish leaders could smooth things over with Pilate than to admit that something supernatural had occurred. And this story, that the disciples made a SEAL Team 6 rescue and stole Jesus' body in the dead of night, that story is still widely told today, rather than simply admit what is obvious. Jesus was dead, and then he wasn't. The tomb is empty because he rose again. I'm going to finish out the chapter. Some of you have heard me read these verses so many times you might be sick of them, but that's okay. Verse 16, "But the 11 disciples," that is minus Judas, "proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful." And we're told elsewhere about the story of doubting Thomas, right, who had to have physical proof of Christ's resurrection. Verse 18, "And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth.